you will hear some tales about the big, red-headed, red-bearded god of thunder and lightning, Thor, one of the favorite gods of the Northmen. Thor's estate was in Asgard, home of all the gods, and it was called Thrudvangur, paddock of power. His hall was known as Bilskirnir, or flashing lightning, and in it were 540 rooms, the largest palace known to man or god. Thor was the strongest of all the gods, and he rode around the earth and across the sky in a rumbling, sparking brass chariot drawn by 2 goats called Tooth Gnasher and Tooth Grinder. His most famous possessions were 3: a hammer made by the dwarfs called Mjolnir, or Crusher, and a strength-increasing belt that, when buckled upon him, gave him divine power twice over. And he had iron gloves, without which he would be unable to catch his hammer when it came hurtling back to him by magic after it was thrown. Thor was patron of farmers as well as fighters, for he was the son of Jord, the Earth Mother, and husband to Sif, the golden-haired goddess of fertility. And of course he is remembered today because his name is part of our calendar. Most of the days of our week are named for gods and goddesses of the Norse mythology, and Thursday is obviously Thor's day. But centuries ago, Thor was best known for his fierce courage and his colossal might and strength. Therefore, he was the gods' chief adversary against their enemies, the giants, and he was protector of heaven and earth. At the last great battle, at Ragnarok, he succeeded in vanquishing the Midgard serpent that encircled the entire earth. But he was killed in turn when the beast vomited forth its poisons upon his unconscious body at the end of their struggle. But before that woeful day, Thor's traditional occupation was traveling about, seeking out giants and trolls, and ridding the world of them by use of his famous hammer. I thought perhaps you would be interested to hear about Thor's most famous journey into Jotunheim, or Giantland, and his meeting with the giant Loki of Outgard, one who was more skilled in magic than he was in weapons. Well, one day, driver Thor set off on his travels with his goats and his chariot, and he had accompanying him that time the crafty mischief-maker Loki. As the sun was setting, they drove up to a farmer's and took lodgings with him for the night. During the evening, Thor led away his goats, and he slaughtered both of them, so that they would all have something to eat. The goats were skinned and stewed, and then Thor and his companions sat down, inviting the farmer and his wife and their 2 children to share the meal. The son was called Thjolfi the Swift, the daughter Roskva Holdfast. Then, as they were eating, Thor spread out the goat skins in front of the fire and told the farmer and his family to pitch the bones onto the hides and on no account to break or split any of those bones. But Thjolfi, the farmer's son, caught hold of one of the goat's thigh bones and split it open with his knife point to get at the marrow, even though he knew he was not supposed to. Thor rested there that night, and in the blackness before Sparrow Peep, he stood up, put his clothes on, caught hold of his hammer, and made 1 or 2 passes over the goat skins, blessing them. At once the goats scrambled to their feet, alive and well and ready to pull Thor's chariot once more. But one, however, was lame in his hind leg, and Thor spotted that and said either the farmer or some bumpkin in his family hadn't dealt wisely with those bones. And there's no use to make a long story about it. The farmer and his family were terrified. They yammered for pardon and offered every penny they had, and then Thor saw how he had terrified them, and his rage left him, and he let himself be pacified by taking the 2 young people of the family, Thjolfi and Roskva, as his servants. And they willingly and happily followed Thor ever after that. So he left his 2 billy goats there with the farmer so that the one could heal his leg, and they went on foot eastward in the direction of Giantland. They went on for 2 days till they came to a dark forest. And finally, at the end of that forest, they decided it was too dark to go on. They spied a monstrously large hall in front of them, and it didn't seem to be that anyone was around. Strange place it was, for it had a great door that went from one end of the front of it to the other. They went inside and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, however, the earth quaked beneath them, and the hall trembled, and they got up, and Thor called to his companions, and they fumbled about and found a short room leading off from the front of that hall. Thor squatted in the doorway, and the others went in behind him, and they were all pretty frightened. Thor gripped his hammer shaft, and they waited for the morning to find out what was making that terrible, snorting, whistling noise. When dawn broke, Thor stepped outside and saw a giant stretched out before him, so huge. It was he who had been making that noise. He was asleep, and he'd been snoring like a pig. Well, Thor buckled on his belt of strength, and just in time, for at that moment the giant woke and stood up. It seemed as if his head almost touched the clouds. For once Thor was so startled, he forgot to use his hammer, and instead he asked the other his name. "I am Screamer," said the giant, "but there's no need for me to ask what you are called. Thor of the gods, isn't it? Now where's my glove?" And he began to search around. It was then that Thor and his companions saw that they had been sleeping not in a hall, but in the giant's glove. And the place where they had hidden was the thumb of the glove. Then Screamer asked them where they were going and if they were afraid to travel with him. And they said no, they weren't, of course. So they sat down and they had breakfast, each out of their own provision bags. But when the giant was finished, he said it would be nice if he carried Thor's provisions for him. And so Thor agreed, not wanting to seem afraid. The giant picked up Thor's breakfast and put it into his bag and tied it up and threw it over his shoulder. And all that day they stalked off. When evening came, they looked about for a place to rest. And the giant said he was going to sleep without any supper, but they could open the provision bag if they wished, and he tossed it to them. Thor picked up the bag, and now what I'm going to say must appear to be a lie, but he couldn't untie a single knot. And no lace end was any looser than the other, so they had to go to bed hungry. And so he was in a rage. He gripped his hammer with both fists, and he decided to crack the skull of that giant lying there snoring. He hit the giant in the head. But Screamer woke up, mumbled something about a leaf having dropped on him. He looked around and asked the others if they had eaten and were ready for bed, and Thor muttered that yes, they were just going to sleep, and they trooped off to the shelter of another oak. About midnight, Thor heard the giant snoring, so rumblingly loud it shook the forest, and he decided to get up, and grasping the hammer, tiptoed toward the giant and flung that hammer full into the middle of the giant's forehead. Screamer sat up again and rubbed his cheek and his head, and he said, "Dang those dirty birds roosting up the tree. You know, I just realized nasty little beggars have messed on me through the twigs. What are you doing up, Thor?" Well, Thor was moving back quickly, saying, nothing. It was still too dark to get awake, and he was just going to lie down. Yet when he lay down again, Thor thought privately to himself, if he got the chance of a third wallop, that giant would be the last to know anything about it. So he lay down with his ear cocked to listen if the giant were asleep. And a little before the gray of dawn, he heard Screamer snoring, and he got up and he leaped at him, swinging his hammer with all his might, and he drove that hammer into the giant's temple, up to the handle. Screamer sat up again. "What's up now?" he grumbled. "An acorn falling on me?" "Oh, Thor, what's biting you? Awake already?" Yes," said Thor. It was time to get up." "All right, time to get dressed. And as a matter of fact, you won't far now from the stronghold known as Outgard. Now, I've heard you gossiping among yourselves that you think I'm not short. Well, let me tell you this. You'll see those in Outgard bigger than I am. Just let me give you a little sound advice. Don't go putting on airs. Loki of Outgard's retainers won't stomach any showing off from such toddling tinies as you are. Better still, why don't you just turn back? I do believe that would be your best plan." Then he slung his provision bag across his back and made off into the woods, and they say the gods didn't even wish him safe journey. Thor and his friends set their foot forward and traveled on till they found themselves in a huge edifice, so that even though they pushed their heads back onto the napes of their neck, they couldn't see the top of the battlements. The door was open, and they entered boldly, and they saw there crowds of giants, and they were huge. They went right up to the front of King Loki of Outgard, and they said how do you do to him, but he was very slow to notice them, and when he did, his upper lip drew back from his teeth, and he sneered. Of course, news travels slowly to us here at the back of beyond, but I may be quite wrong in what I think. Can this young bully boy be Two-Goat Thor? No, there must be more about you than appears at this moment. Now here's your chance, since you come among us. Let me tell you, no one stays here unless he's better or clever or stronger than everyone else. Loki blurted out, Well, I can eat more than anybody here. I'll bet I can eat a good square meal quicker than anyone. Loki of Outgard said, Well, that will be a feat if you can bring it off. And he called for one of his followers named Logi. And a great big trough was set up in the middle of the hall, piled high with meat. Loki took his station at one end and Logi at the other, and they both began to gobble as fast as they could. So fast they met right in the middle of the trough, and Loki had eaten every morsel of meat off the bones. But Logi had eaten the meat and the bones, and half the trough as well. Loki had lost that little game, and he sat down quite full, but quite dispirited. Then Loki of Outgard asked if the young fellow could do anything, and Thjolfi said he was prepared to race anyone. Loki of Outgard said that would be a notable sport indeed, and he called one of his fellows named Hugi. And he was to run this match against Thjolfi. They ran on a great open plain. But Hugi ran to the end of the track and turned to meet Thjolfi when Thjolfi was only halfway on the first lap, and everyone said that contest had been well and truly decided. And then the giant king, Loki of Outgard, turned to Thor, and they said, What particular bit of prowess was Thor going to put on display for them? They'd heard so much talk about him. Thor said he'd have a drinking match with anyone. Loki of Outgard called for his cupbearers to bring in the cup that they used for contests. At once the cupbearer came and dropped a cup into Thor's hands, a drinking horn. Loki of Outgard said, It's looked upon as good drinking around here when you toss off this horn in one draught, though some of us take two. But nobody here is so unparched as not to be able to down it in 3 swigs. Thor examined the horn. He thought it did not appear to be very wide, though it was pretty long. Still, he had a fine thirst on him, so he began to drink. With such huge swallows, he believed he wouldn't need to bow his head over that horn more than once. At last his breath gave out, and he looked to see what progress he had made in the drinking. When he looked inside the horn, thinking it would be almost gone, he found there was scarcely any difference between the level now and the level before he started. Loki of Outgard said, Oh, well drunk, though I wonder, no, I see you haven't swilled in excess. Do you know, if anyone had told me Thor of the gods couldn't quaff larger than that, I should never have believed him. Oh, but I know what you're up to. You intend to make quite certain of polishing it off in 2 goes. Well, let's see how you do it. Thor didn't say a word. He just jammed that horn rim into his mouth, intending to drink the drink, to end all drinks, and he did so, up to the final squeak of wind in him. But when he looked again, it hadn't gone down very much at all. What's up now, Thor? Aren't you holding yourself back a bit too much for your last drink? Seems to me if you're going to drain the horn with a 3rd drink, it's got to be the biggest yet. And everyone in the hall laughed. Thor was furious, and he rammed that horn into his teeth, and he sucked like a whirlpool, just as long as he was able. But when he looked inside, though the level had dropped a bit, it was still rather full. Thor thrust the horn from him and would not drink again. Would you like to try something else? Loki of Outgard asked. And Thor growled, I'm game for anything. What other tricks have you got up your sleeve for me? And Loki of Outgard said, Well, there is a game that the littlest boys play around here. We hardly call it much. It's just picking up my cat. Now I hardly know how to mention such a thing to Thor of the gods save us, if I hadn't already seen you are much less account than I used to think. Just then, a big gray tabby cat gambled across the end of the hall floor, and Thor went right up to it, placed his hands under its belly, and shoved up. But the cat arched its back every time. Every time Thor pushed, he couldn't pick that cat up. He pushed as far as he could stretch, and the cat only lifted one paw off the ground. That was the most Thor could achieve. Loki of Outgard said, "I thought so. The cat is rather a large cat, while Thor is short. Stunted even, compared to the giants we are accustomed to." Thor snapped, "Stunted as you say I am, let somebody step up quick and wrestle with me. For now I'm really angry." Loki of Outgard glanced along the tables, and he said, "Do you know I don't see a single man present who wouldn't consider it beneath his dignity to wrestle with you? But I will call my old nurse, Ellie. See if you can try a fall with her." The very next instant, a very old woman hobbled into the hall. Loki of Outgard said she should try a hold with Thor of the gods, and not to make a long story of it, Thor exerted himself, but the more he did, the more rock-like she stood, and then she herself began to buckle to and found Thor a little unsteady on his feet until she wrestled him down till he was on one knee. Loki of Outgard stepped up to the strugglers and ordered them to break. By this time it was well into evening, and Loki of Outgard showed Thor and his companions to their seats, and they ate and they drank. And next morning Loki gave them breakfast, and then they set off on their return journey, Loki of Outgard following them out, going with them beyond the gates of the stronghold. Now as they were about to part, he addressed Thor and asked him whether he was pleased with his trip, or if he felt he had come across people of more consequence than himself, and Thor acknowledged that he had been taken down a peg or two. "You must think me a straw man, and that goes against my grain," said Thor. But Loki of Outgard replied, "Now that we're out of the stronghold at last, I'll let you into a little secret. I might say in passing that as long as I live, you will never get inside my stronghold again. I'll tell you right out, you never would have gotten inside at all if I had known then what I know now about you and your strength and courage that brought us all to within an inch of destruction. For you see, I bewitched you into seeing hallucinations. The first was when I met you in the forest. I was the giant screamer. When you tried to undo the provision bag, I had clamped it closed with magic wire which no one could untie. After that, when you struck at me 3 times with your hammer, well, the first blow was the least, and it would have killed me if it had hit me. But you see, each time you went to hit me, I put a whole mountain in your way. When you go by, you will see 3 box-shaped valleys that were not there 2 days ago. Those were the imprints of your hammer. Likewise with the various contests your party had with my retainers. The first one, for instance, your man Loki tried. He was certainly famished and he gobbled quick enough, but instead of a man, I used wildfire. And of course he ate the trough as fast as the meat. And when Thjolfi tried racing, the boy I called Hugi, why, he was just a thought out of my head. You could hardly expect Thjolfi or anyone to speed quicker than thought. You yourself swigged from the horn and thought you were making slow progress, but strike me dumb. The end of that horn, unknown to you, was in the ocean. When you come to the sea, you will find that you have made it lower than it ever was before. That cat, I thought it was something when you pushed up the cat's belly. As a matter of fact, there wasn't a fellow there shivering in his shoes when they saw you raise one of its paws off the ground, for of course that cat was the Midgard serpent that encircles the land. It was a wonder when you pushed it up you almost touched the heavens with it. An equal wonder was during the wrestling when you stood so firm and went down only on one knee in your struggle against old Ellie. You did not know it, but old Ellie is old age itself. No one can fight her. Now, I'll tell you the truth. We must part company here, and it will be better for all concerned if we never meet again. In future, I shall always protect my stronghold with such like spells. You'll never be able to get at me." And Thor, who had heard this tale in amazement, seized his hammer and swung it into the air, but before he could strike one blow, Loki of Outgard had vanished. He whipped around to face the stronghold, intending to smash it to bits, but he only saw there an empty valley and no stronghold at all. So then he turned once more, and he set his foot on the path for home, with many things to think about on the way. Well, if Thor was tricked by the giants that time, he got his revenge on another occasion, when one day his hammer was stolen. Thor woke up one morning in Asgard to find his hammer missing. And if it wasn't Loki who had taken it, it had to be the giant, so he called Loki, and when Loki assured him he didn't have it, he went dragging Loki off to the palace of the goddess Freya, and asked Freya if she would lend them her feather cloak so that Loki might wear it and fly into Giant Land to seek that stolen hammer. That hammer was their greatest defense against the giants, their enemies, and they needed it. Freya willingly consented, and Loki put the cloak off and flew off at once to Jotunheim, and from a distance he saw Hrym, the giant king, sitting on a mound plaiting leashes of gold for his dogs, trimming the manes of his golden horses, and without stopping, Thrymr asked Loki how the gods and elves were doing, knowing full well the stew they were in over the loss of that hammer that protected them. Loki answered frankly the gods and the elves were not doing very well, and asked straight out if Thrymr had hidden Thor's hammer. Thrymr was equally frank. I have Thor's hammer, and I've hidden it 8 miles beneath the earth, and nobody will get it back until I get Freya for my wife. Loki flew back to Asgard quick as he could, and Thor was asking there for the news and found out that the giant had it and would only trade it for Freya, the goddess. And Thor grabbed Loki and dragged him off before Freya, bluntly ordering her to put on a bridal veil and drive with him to Giant Land. But Freya got angry. So angry, her breast swelled and she broke the famous necklace Brisingamen. She refused to marry any giant, of course. Well, the gods called a council and debated what should be done. Heimdall, the one who guarded the Rainbow Bridge, suggested a plan, and that was that Thor himself should be got up as a bride, draped over with a veil, with petticoats hiding his legs, and a housewife's keys dangling from a chain at his waist, brooches on his bust. Above all, to show it was really Freya, he must wear Brisingamen. Thor was reluctant to dress up as a woman. He thought everyone would call him a sissy forever after that. But Loki, who thought it was a funny thing to do, offered to go along with him disguised as a maidservant, and to put on women's clothes too. And Thor knew if Loki had to be dressed like that, there would be no one who would make fun of him later on. So, it was either have the giants crowd over the Asgard walls, or Thor consent to be dressed like a woman and go after his hammer himself. And this is what they did. They all dressed up. The goats were led in and harnessed to the brass chariot, and with rumbles of thunder and flashes of lightning, Thor and Loki drove into Giant Land. Thrymr heard the approach of the chariot, and he called for the giants to strew the benches and bring the ale and set up the tables and prepare the wedding feast for his beautiful new bride, Freya, goddess of love and beauty. When evening came, the feast was set, and the bride ate a whole ox, 8 salmon, and all the dainties intended for the ladies, and washed down the lot with 3 barrels of mead. Even Thrymr the giant was astonished to observe that he had never seen a maiden with such an appetite or thirst. And so that he wouldn't become suspicious, cunning Loki, dressed as a maidservant of course, said, "Oh, Freya hasn't eaten a thing for a week. Knowing that she was coming here to marry you, she's been so excited." Thrymr thought that was very nice, and so he wanted to steal a kiss from his bride. He lifted a corner of her veil. Of course, Thor didn't want any kisses from any giant, and he flashed his eyes at the giant. The giant leaped back in surprise when he saw those red-rimmed, bloodshot eyes glaring at him, and he was becoming a little suspicious, but handmaid Loki said, "Oh, well, Freya's eyes are fiery because, well, she hasn't slept for a week before driving to Giant Land." Then Thrymr's sister asked Freya for the bridal fee, a present of all the red gold rings she was wearing. "But first," Loki said, "bring the hammer to make sure you have it." So Thrymr called for the marriage to be celebrated in the traditional way, and that Thor's hammer should be laid on the bride's knee while both bride and groom swore their vows to the goddess Var. But as soon as Thor felt Mjolnir within his grasp, his heart chuckled in his breast, and with the first swipe he felled the giant king, and with the next the greedy sister who got death from the hammer instead of many rings. That was how Thor got his hammer again.